and today is Tuesday, January 16th, 2024. And our call-in number is 563-999-3581. Press 1, and that puts you into queue to talk to us. And we'd love to hear your comments and questions because that makes this your show. And, excuse me, we are doing the Enlightenment Study, and so today's number 2. And I created a page on the website, and it's go to whyagain.org, and over there's a section that says Kaboris, and underneath it there's actually a title that says just Enlightenment, and that talks about the book. Underneath it, it says Enlightenment Study. And so if you click on that, it will take you to a page where I'm going to be I'm editing out the second hour and actually putting it up on YouTube. And so you'll be able to click and listen to the archives either via YouTube, or I've recorded yesterday's on Podbean simultaneously, and I'm going to try to do that again today. And so you'll be able to pick it up either of those places, but that way they'll all be in one place. A couple of people wrote me and said that, did they miss the show? And so I'm not sure what happened there because it was active and working yesterday, and we had a couple of questions, and we appreciate your input on that. So when Michael gets on, we will start day 2 of the Enlightenment Study. And I will just say, Michael will be going, not this week, but next week. He's actually in a medical class on, he's driving on Thursday, and he's in the class on Friday. So those 2 days, I'm going to play, we did a show on the Kaboris manuscript being a source, being a true source to rely on. And then also we've got the Aramaicisms. So anytime we have to play a show, so Thursday I'm going to play the Kaboris show, and then Friday I'll play in Aramaicisms. And then anytime during the Enlightenment Study that we need to play one, I'll play the next Aramaicisms. There's actually 4 of those, 4 hours. And so it'll still be in alignment with what we're doing. And if you haven't ordered your Enlightenment book and you would like to have one to go along with us, I'll just say again, you can order it through our catalog if you click on Shop. However, the system automatically adds $9 shipping. So during this study, we're offering the special that if you just go to the donate button, and I've got this also on that Enlightenment Study page, so everything's together on that, but if you just go to the donate button and donate $26, and that extra dollar covers the fees that PayPal hits us with, and we will pay the shipping and handling and get the book out to you. Mail hasn't run yet today. We're under about 7 inches of snow, but I do have about 8 books here ready to go out. So you all that have ordered it over the weekend, mail didn't run yesterday because of the holiday. So they're ready, wrapped and ready to go out today. Anyway, you'll be able to pick up the archives of the Enlightenment show under that one link, so you won't have to go searching for them. And we hope that you enjoy and participate with us. And so still waiting on Michael to show up on my switchboard. And if you have any questions, please press 1. If you're listening on a station where we can't see you, please go dial in at 563-999-3581 and press 1, and that will put you into queue. And we do have a hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and turn on Susan's microphone while I'm still waiting on Michael to dial in. How are you doing, young lady?
Hi, Jeannie. Hi. I must have missed something essential when you start talking about this Enlightenment Study. Is this the manuscript, the Kaboris manuscript that you're talking about when you're talking about a book?
Actually, the book called The Enlightenment is a spiral-bound book, about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick, and it's what had been translated so far out of the Kaboris. So yes, it's based on the Kaboris, and it's what had been translated out, and so it includes the history of the Kaboris. Right.
Yeah, it's actually
go
what
ahead,
we've
Michael.
published so far from it. Yeah, it does not include all of the translation work, but it is what we've published so far from the Khabouris manuscript.
So I already have that then.
I don't know for sure, but I would think so. It's a yellow, or pardon me, a beige color, kind of a beige tan color. Looks a little bit like a piece of parchment. And
yeah. Okay.
That's what we're going to do. That's what we're doing.
Great. Great. Well, and you're actually reading out of it as we go. Sorry, I feel as if I've probably been listening and it's gone in one ear and out the other. But you're talking about
that
this
probably is an indicator. That's probably been an indicator, or is an indicator that you're in process. So, and you're paying attention to what's moving on the inside. That's always a good thing.
Well, I don't know. You can make all kind remarks you want, but I know you've been talking about this, and I've been missing something so basic that when I go to the website, I've just gone just now, and I think I found the spot, and it does look like the manuscript I already have, but I couldn't find the title to look the same. And so I just thought I'd...
Yeah, it's what we've published so far. There are 3 sections in the book. There's the story about how the book was found. There are some select passages from the New Testament. And then what the translators did back in the 70s when the original translation work was done was did the best they could do to establish the first century meanings of Yeshua's words. So that's what we're heading toward is a comprehension of what those mean. And it's a part actually of our Laws of Living course as well. So anybody who's done Laws of Living, Enlightenment came as part of that course. In some cases, it was printed actually right into the Laws of Living course. In other cases, it was a separate book of it. That's what's there. And if there's anybody out there, you've got one, but if there's anybody out there that needs a copy or wants a copy to follow along, I don't know how long our work with this is going to take. I suspect we'll probably spend at least a year on it. Although I haven't set out a lesson plan, I'm just kind of with it and developing the daily conversation as we move along. So I'm not sure how long that's going to stretch out. But if anybody wants to get a copy of it, normally if you order from the website, it adds shipping, which is another $8 or $9. And if you order it by going to our website and down toward the bottom, there's a donate button. If you click the donate button and donate $26, the manuscript's $25. PayPal takes $1.25, so if you donate $26, we'll cover the shipping. So, just if anybody orders it, if you would just put your name and your address, so we know where to send it, and the word enlightenment, so we'll know what to send you. So, but that's where we're heading, young lady. So, are you ready to go rock and roll? Ready to go for it?
Yeah, I guess so. I should say yes.
You sound like you may be in a lot of process.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I don't feel badly, but I've lost my voice. Tim has had pneumonia, and he's getting better. He's been home. He hasn't.
Ouch! Bless his heart.
But maybe something's moving around the house. Michael is sick too. All 3 of us are doing something. I'm not sure what.
Well, get yourself some lemon and cayenne pepper, maybe a little bit of oregano oil. If you do oregano oil,
I've been doing those.
Oh, good. Okay, well, that'll probably keep you from getting a deeper level of the crud then.
I like how you call it the crud. One thing I like about my deep voice is I sound more like Alan Watts. I love his voice. I love his chuckle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll carry on.
All right, young lady.
Good.
Okay, Miss Jean, do we have anybody else in the phone queue with a hand up or anything happening in the chat room?
No, it is all quiet on the home front.
All right. Well, let's move forward. We had given a couple of quotes, and I'll do more of those as we unfold, but we've given a couple of quotes on how some of the Greek translations are just ridiculous and how when you hear the Aramaic, it all of a sudden makes sense. But I want to move in just a little different direction. And I was looking at quotes that examples of quotes that don't make sense in Greek but make sense in Aramaic. And one of the commands that we hear over and over and over again, whether it's in the Greek or in the Aramaic, is the command to heal one's mind of fear. So well over 300 times. There's actually, I think it's a kind of an old wives' tale, but there are people who say there are 365 times this command appears, and I've never sat down and counted, but from just researching, people say, well, that's really not, it's not actually that number, but it's pretty close. That 365 times or 300 plus times in those ancient scriptures, we're told something, a variation on the phrase of fear not. Things like perfect love casts out fear. We hear Job saying, that which I feared most has come upon me. And it's clearly an important issue to deal with. In fact, it's the filter that destroys most people's reading of the scriptures themselves, because if fear is active, all that the mind can show is something that's based in irritation and upset. And so we have people with all kinds of irritation and upset, have no idea that it's about what's going on in their own minds. They think it actually comes from the scriptures, and they stand up there and they rage and they rail out of their own unresolved hostility and fear. But if you look at this fear, you hear that statement, and it speaks of fear. And again, this does come through clearly in the Greek, almost as a demon, to be cast out. So I want to kind of take a look at that, but I'm going to, before we delve deeper into it, I want to read a story from a Canadian newspaper that was printed in 1942. And the reason I'm reading this story is because it's a really good example of how we can get trapped in living in a fantastical world and thinking that we're in the actual world. For me, what I've learned from the Aramaic Yeshua is that his words, his directions, his tools are always pointing us in the direction of experiencing the actuality of the Creator as the Creator created it, rather than realities built by the brain cells in our minds, rather than reality, the constructs of the mind, rather than perception, that we need to undo perception, which is fantasy land, and return to the actuality. So here's the story. The title of the story is, oh, my page just jumped. Come on now, stop it. The title of the story is Two Places, 2 Centuries at One Time, ? And it answers that story, or pardon me, it asks the question, can a ship be in 2 places at the same time? And it answers that and says, under certain conditions, the answer is yes, ! Now, for me, this simple introduction to this article shows how insane we can be. If we live in perception, and you remember that Yeshua warns us, don't judge by appearances. I'd offer that the word appearance and perception here could be interchangeable. So this is the insanity of perception. Here this article is being printed saying that, yes, there are conditions in which you can be in 2 places at the same time. So the story goes on to unfold one of those conditions, ostensibly. But you'll notice that most of it's about a fantasy. And to me, this is just a really powerful example of how so often we live in fantasies created by men's minds. Now, sometimes, as we've pointed out in the past, our fantasies are useful. Like, we have a radio show at 12 o'clock every day, 1 o'clock every day. Well, in the actuality, time doesn't exist. It's something we made up, but it's a useful fantasy. And so, great, it's a useful fantasy. I think that you can use a fantasy without knowing it, and it can be very destructive. If you use a fantasy knowing that it is a fantasy, it's just a construct that we made up, it can be useful. You don't get trapped in crazy stuff if you understand that something is a fantasy. So the article unfolds. Captain John Duthie Sidney Phillips was a shipmaster who managed an unusual feat of navigation. For some 15 years, Skipper Phillips commanded liners on the Vancouver, Australia run. Now a resident of Sydney. So this is referring back, actually. This guy was a ship captain back in the late 1900s, late 18, early 1900s. And he now lives in Australia, and this article is printed in 1942. So it's been a few decades since it happened, but they explain why they're writing this article. Now a resident of Sydney, Captain Phillips has been looking through his old logbooks, and he's produced a record of a remarkable incident. It deals with the international date line, which passengers. They turn in at night to find that on awakening, they've lost a day. So remember, when you cross the international date line, you lose a whole day, not just a couple of hours like, daylight saving time, forward and backward, but when you cross the date line, a whole day disappears. This line bisects the equator between the Ellice and Phoenix Islands, and it was there that Captain Phillips put a ship in two places at once. Again, a fantasy. They're speaking about it like it's an actuality. It clearly is not an actuality, as you will see. He was in command of the Warramoo, that was the name of the ship, bound from Vancouver to Brisbane, Australia, early on December 30th, 1899. So we're the day before New Year's Eve on in 1899. His second in command, Captain F.J. Baldon, pointed out that if he cared to alter the ship's course a degree or two and suitably adjust her speed, they could cross the 180th meridian, where it intersected with the equator, at exactly 12 midnight. This prankish idea appealed to Captain Phillips, and the necessary orders were given. 5 experienced navigators took careful observations of the sun when it was visible and the stars at night. The ship's position was checked every 3 hours, and she reached the appointed spot at the appointed time. Now, if you do some research on this, you'll find that today the state of navigation says it was very unlikely with the technology at that time that they actually did this, but theoretically they did it. But the technology probably wasn't accurate enough that they actually were in the physical location that they described being, but that's an aside. So here is where the perception and the fantasy world of appearances become clear. And they describe the positioning of the ship. The bow of the Warramoo was in the southern hemisphere. Now, is there a southern hemisphere and a northern hemisphere? Is there north and south? No. That's something we made up. It's useful. Gee, if I'm heading to your house and you're north of me, it's a good thing if I know north from south. But in fact, that's just something we constructed. Do you think when a bird flies south for the winter, if you stopped it and said, well, which direction are you flying, it would say south? No. The actuality doesn't contain a north and a south. But we made up words and a concept that is very useful. So its bow is in the southern hemisphere, a fantasy, but her stern was in the northern hemisphere, another fantasy. One side of her was in the western hemisphere, another fantasy. The other in the eastern hemisphere, still another fantasy. The passengers and crew in the forward part of the ship were living on Monday, January 1st, 1900. Now, we made up the calendar. It's another fantasy, so not actuality. So the passengers at the front of the ship To them, the date is Monday, January 1st, 1900, and the passengers and crew in the back of the ship were still on Saturday. Remember that date disappears? December 30th, 1899. They lost a day. Those forward were in a new century. Those aft were in the old century. And those aboard were the first people on Earth to hail the new century and the last to bid the old century farewell. 2 continents, 1 fantasy. Now, I hope I read that and explained that in a way that makes sense. That, here it is positioned so that the 4 quadrants of the ship are in fantastically generated places, ideas generated by our minds, appearances, that bear no resemblance whatsoever to actuality. This whole thing about hemispheres and latitude and longitude are things that we made up. Useful. And the reason I'm talking about this so much is when you look at the world, and I introduced this with the idea of perfect love casts out fear, when you look at the world of fear, it is a fantasy made up by men. And if you listen to the instructions from a man named Job, who went through all these trials and tribulations, he announces the conclusion he comes to as to why he lived in such trauma. And that is, that which I feared most has come upon me. That which I dreaded has happened to me. Now, I'd offer that fear is a resistant energy to truth that we've made up, and it's a fantasy. It's something we've created. And if we're living in the actuality of who we are, then love displaces that fantasy. And to me, that's the whole essence of the New Testament. That's the whole essence on a practical level of attempting to get people out of the fantastical world with which they create the very results that they're resisting by being in fear in that fantasy, because fear becomes the amplifier for the creative energy that they hold, and that creative energy is about what they don't want, and so they create it. So my offering, as we're looking at this Aramaic study and going to a new depth, hopefully, is that the Aramaic teachings of Yeshua are continuously pointing us to actuality, and the Greek words are a reflection of perception, and therefore tend to keep us in this fantastical world of the made up, of the fantasy. Now, perception is an interesting world. Fascinating. But like our story of the Waramu, the name of the boat, it's a fantasy. You listen at one point, I believe this is what Yeshua was referring to when he spoke about, those who are the highest in the realm of fantasy. In other words, the genius mind living out of carbon-based memory that lives in perception can seem like the genius and, boy, got everything together and figured out, but they're the very lowest when they move into the actuality, because they're still, even though their fantasies are pretty good, even though their perception's pretty good, it isn't actuality. And what Yeshua is attempting to get people to do is step out of the constructs of their minds, the realities based on generations and generations and generations of fantasies, especially fantasies based in fear, learning to forgive those, and to return to the truth of who we are. One who's stuck in this world of perception, which Yeshua offers a tool for defeating that world, for ridding yourself of that world, and that tool is called forgiveness. Now notice that the Greeks took forgiveness and put it into a fantasy, the perceptual world of, you're the problem in my life, you're the reason I'm experiencing this, therefore I will forgive you. And if you are in that world, if you're playing that game, then you qualify for being one of the lowest if you are thinking about moving on to the next level of actuality, because the mind's still living in a fantasy world. And Yeshua had a term for living in that world. It's reflected in a passage shortly after Yeshua comes out of the Garden of Gethsemane. And Peter has injured the high priest's servant. And he's stepped in to try to prevent the demonstration that Yeshua had planned. Like, he's going to stop him. You remember that Peter, on the way to Gethsemane, asks Yeshua, out of his fantastical mind and his fantastical world, how many swords should we bring? They're expecting that Yeshua is going to be the swordsman that defeats the whole Roman world. And Yeshua says, well, just bring one. Yeshua, living in the actuality, has a reason for allowing him to bring a sword. He's got a lesson to teach him. Peter thinks he's bringing the sword so that Yeshua can wipe out the Roman world. And Peter turns this sword on the high priest servant, who is going to have Yeshua mercilessly slaughtered. And Peter's being the valiant, living in perception, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to kill the high priest servant. If you remember, Yeshua had a name for him. And I'd offer this name is a name that applies to anyone that's living in perception, who's living in this fantastical world of what was also in the scriptures called the mind of man. So Peter, in that situation, Yeshua turns directly to Peter and says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." And to read it from the Greek, "Get thee behind me, Satan, thou art an offense to me, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." Now, if you've got the brain cells for it, you can understand that he's saying you're either living in perception or actuality. The Aramaic is closer. The Aramaic says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me because you do not reason of God, but of humans." In other words, you're stuck in the mind of man rather than the plan of God. You're stuck in perception, a construct of your mind based on your fantasy of fear. And that fantasy of fear, when it's turned into perception, keeps you from understanding what I'm doing here. Get out of my way. You're blocking exactly what I'm here to teach. Now, just a little aside, I've had people who've heard me present that explanation before that have said, well, Michael, did you notice that by stopping Peter, that got him dead? And my response has always been, well, yes, I noticed that Yeshua stopping Peter from saving him got him dead. Did you notice he couldn't keep him that way? Priest servants and all the king's men couldn't keep Yeshua from life. And many people have a great admiration for suffering. In fact, they're told to just give their suffering over to God, like God wants suffering. You know, God wants sacrifice. Go read the passage that says, just sacrificing those bulls, the smell of that blood is horrible to my nostrils. Stop it. And yet, there's still this whole theory about suffering. And if you understand that passage correctly, where Peter says, or Yeshua says, "Get behind me," Yeshua has a plan. And he's demonstrating, many people have interpreted that whole thing in the crucifixion as the power and wonderment of suffering and how we're saved by suffering. But if you've got that's perception, that's living in the fantasy world of fear and suffering. And if you've got the brain cells, then what you understand is what he was doing was demonstrating the power of living as a human being. The power of living is love. Peter injures the archenemy. Yeshua stops him. He probably would have put the sword through him if he'd had another chance. You can bet he wasn't just shooting for an ear. He was shooting to take his head off. Yeshua stops him. And then, rather than dressing down the high priest servant and finishing the job of killing him, what does Yeshua do? He demonstrates the power of living a human life, the power of living out of love, out of the actuality of who we are, rather than being stuck in the mind of man, which he clearly describes is the definition of Satan. Most people in our world live in the constructs of their minds and know no better and know nothing other than that. But what Yeshua demonstrated was, here's the arch enemy. Am I going to hate him? Am I going to live out of the fantasy of fear and kill and murder and slaughter and all of that crazy stuff? No. He demonstrates the power of reaching forward, not yielding his human life to the trauma that's before him, but bringing love to the party, bringing love to the presence of that experience, all the way through to the crucifixion. He demonstrated they couldn't keep him dead. He did that by living in the actuality of functioning as a human being rather than being stuck in the mind of man. When you hear that fear not fantasy, when you listen to things that are based in fear, it's the fantasies of fear that destroy us. And it's pretty tough to get that from the Greek translations. And why I'm bringing that up is to really anchor the reason why we're going to look step by step more deeply into the Aramaic language and the teachings of Yeshua from the Aramaic perspective rather than from the Greek. So in essence, that fear not command would be followed with live in the actuality, live as the present perception of love rather than these fantasies of fear with which you destroy yourself. So if we understand the implications of Yeshua's teachings in Aramaic, of which the Greeks didn't have a clue, and you'll know how strongly the Greeks will claim everything if you let them. If you saw the movie, what came to mind as I was working on this was, if you saw the movie My Great Big Fat Greek Wedding, you remember the father was always proclaiming how the Greeks did it, the Greeks created it, the Greeks owned it, the Greeks made it up, the Greeks discovered it, the Greeks, the Greeks, the Greeks, the Greeks. Well, they were at that time pretty much the highest, I think, of men living in perception, living in the constructs of carbon-based memory. Now, if you recognize that, and you'll run into people, if you have a conversation, and in some cases it's best just to leave the conversation alone because people can get pretty upset and pretty vicious if they're going to tend to project their unresolved fear, which is why they're living in perception, if you tell them that the Aramaic came first. You know, I mean, think about it. If you're, let's say you're a person who's, well, you're still paying tens of thousands of dollars off in school loans in order to get your advanced degree in Greek theology. And when I invite you to recognize that your interpretation of the scriptures is totally, completely off base and false, I mean, let's take a look at it. We got about 2,000 years of Greek translations and thought, which is, you know, in most educated circles, it's all Greek. It's really believed that it's Greek. We've got about 2,000 years of it, and we're now at somewhere in the range of about 32,000 different sects of perceptual fantasies, that is, so-called Christian sect, believe they have the idea, and they just happen to be one of the lucky ones that was born into the right denomination that had the actual truth, because the other 31,999 didn't know. Don't expect the PhD to jump up and down, the one that's a tenured professor still paying off his or her loans, to jump up and down and go, oh, it was Aramaic? You mean I get to throw out everything I've got and I have to go back to school and start over? Or I have to go get a shovel and get a job? That's kind of what you're asking somebody to do when you ask them to acknowledge that the Aramaic was prime. So the Greek mistranslations and the Greek misunderstandings are in terms of applicability, like a shadow compared to the in-depth understanding of the Aramaic words. To the degree that you'll notice that one of the foundations of most Greek theologians, Greek-trained theologians, and this is in the name of a man who on at least 15 occasions said something to the effect of, variations on the theme with words, but basically said, fear not. And yet you'll hear the Greek-trained preachers tell you, and actually worshiping unknowingly, in the Aramaic context, a demon. You know, if you think about perfect love casts out fear, fear is a demon to be cast out, and yet we get people at very high levels who will tell you that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Now, if that's not worshiping a demon, when you realize fear is just a demon, it's just an error in the mind that needs to be corrected. If over 300 times in the scriptures, and at least 15 times Yeshua says, fear not, why would anybody even start to put forward a thought, especially a trained, educated person in the field, put forward a thought like fear of God is the beginning of wisdom? This is worshiping a demon in the Aramaic context now, not the Greek context with the demons and the evil, ugly, nasty beings and their critters and all of that. Just in the real reality of it, telling us that the way to deep relationship with the Creator is through fear. The deep relationship, entering into relationship with love, comes from fear, and that's where you start with the wisdom. And that's about the level of wisdom that comes from perception, from the constructs of the human mind. And again, in the Aramaic, Yeshua is always pointing us to the actuality, living, how to live in the actuality of the Creator, not how to live in perception, how to live in appearances. Someone who believes the story about the Wamu, about this ship being in 4 different locations at the same time, in 2 different centuries, on 2 different oceans, in 2 hemispheres, you know, I mean, believing that that's possible. Yes, they were in this position on the earth. And we made up a story. We created a fantasy about hemispheres and date lines and longitude and latitude, but it's all made up. And the article that said we could be in certain conditions in 2 different places at the same time is, of course, silly. And so much of what comes out of everything that's based, if you've ever heard a preacher railing, everything that's based in hostility or fear is insane relative to unity. In recognizing the truth of who we are, the unity that is humanity, the so-called mystical body of Christ. There's nothing religious about it. Einstein even agrees with it. Einstein says if you think you're separate or separated from the rest of humanity, you're living in an optical delusion. So the truth is, in the actuality, there is one energy system that we are a part of. We're all cells in it, so to speak. That's another good metaphor for coming out of the perceptual belief in separation. And when we start to experience from there, then we've moved from perhaps being the highest in the intellectual realm, in the fantasy world, in perception, into just starting on the lower rungs of the ladder of actuality, of living as we're designed to do. And so I hope that makes sense as a kind of another piece of the foundation of where we're going. And if anyone has any questions, comments, thoughts, you're welcome at any time through this study to put your hand up. And you know, let's get right down into the very depths of it. And if questions are there, let's get them answered, or at least let's entertain them. and see where we can move with it so that we can move forward. Ms. Jeannie, do we have anybody in the phone queue with a hand up or anything happening in the chat room? And by the way, if somebody's, we're here to support the forgiveness work, so if somebody has a question in that arena, you're welcome to put your hand up anytime through it, and we'll go into answering questions about forgiveness or any and all of the tools. If you're doing the codependence to interdependence communication practical and self-study, we're here to support you. Any questions that come up, ask them at any time. So, Ms. Jeannie, do we have anything happening in the phone queue or?
No, it is all quiet. No hands up.
Okay. Well, I hope that's because everybody's getting this and processing, going, yes, rock and roll. So I want to then to lay the groundwork for the practical aspect of understanding the Aramaic teachings rather than getting lost in the Greek. There's one single idea that is conveyed in the Aramaic that is totally lost in the Greek, that I believe is responsible for millions of deaths, millions of divorces, murders, conflicts, and even wars. One simple idea that when it was translated into the Greek doesn't make any sense. When you've got the Aramaic brain cells, it not only makes sense, but it gives you an understanding of how to move out of the power person dynamics, the generational hostility, fear, and abuse that tends to run the world. In fact, this single principle, the power person dynamic, I would offer runs 99.999% of the world, 99.999% of the time. And I don't care whether you're talking about businesses or families or communities or churches, this dynamic is running the world. And the world at this moment, if you think of sanity being living in and as the presence of love, the world's pretty insane, pretty bizarre. So what is this one idea that's destroyed millions of lives and is doing so today? So one of the things you'll hear Yeshua say is, the way the Greeks translate it is, sufficient for the day are the evils thereof. And you look at that in Greek and you go, what the heck? Sufficient for the day are the evils thereof. Like, what does that even start to mean? And yet, this is a core pivot point if you understand the Aramaic in terms of healing one's mind. You wouldn't know it when you look at the fantastical world of perception, as the Greeks have brainwashed us into, that he was talking here about stress and giving people a message as to how to stay out of the kind of stress that leads to violence. You remember when we've talked about the power person dynamic, that once the power person dynamic is instilled in someone's mind, it will run their lives for the rest of their lives, and they'll be limited to just 3 behaviors related to the power person. If you haven't heard this conversation, I'll just throw in a few, some of the basic foundational ideas and then work up to why this particular passage is so important. The power person is usually a parent, and it's usually an interaction between a parent and a child, although not necessarily. It can happen in other circumstances as well. And 3 things happen to instill a power person dynamic in a child's mind. Number 1, the power person, usually the parent, has more power over the child than the child has. Number 2, the power person, the parent, is not functioning as a human being. They're not functioning as love. They're functioning out of some form of hostility or fear, functioning out of perception. And 3, the child, the object of the situation, perceives the circumstance as survival. So when those 3 things happen, the energy field of the child opens. When you think of us, rather than being physical beings, as energetic beings, we open on every level in that circumstance. When those 3 conditions are met, our field, if we're the child in the situation, opens. And when we open, we become like a sponge and just suck in every energy from the environment. Literally, just sucking the energy in. Doesn't matter. The energy does not need to be spoken or expressed in any way, shape, or form. All it has to do is be there. The parent who's standing there with a clenched fist, enraged and trying to calmly direct the child as to what to do, the child is still absorbing the energy of rage. They just take everything on from the environment. And then, once they're past that circumstance, the rest of their lives, until that dynamic is understood and resolved, forgiven in them, that dynamic will run the rest child's life. This has been going on forever, generation after generation after generation. When that occurs, there are only 3 behaviors possible for that child. I don't care if that child has grown into an adult of 90 years. There are only 3 behaviors possible. And the behaviors they will do will be related to the level of stress that they are under. When there's no stress, they'll do whatever their they'll do whatever they did to get along with their power person. No stress, little stress, they'll do what they did to get along with their power person. When stress starts to build in that person's life, they'll do whatever they did to resist and survive with their power person. When that person becomes ultra stressed, they'll do whatever their power person did to them that they hated the most. That runs the world. Now, why is this passage, sufficient for the day are the evils thereof, so important to that circumstance? What does one have to do with the other? Well, if you go to the Aramaic passage where we're told it says, sufficient for the day are the evils thereof, what you find is that the word evil there, as translated, has nothing to do with the whole Greek evil, demons, nasty way. It's got nothing to do with that. The word evil has 2 different translations, or at least 2 different meanings in Aramaic, depending on context, syntax, and such. One, it's related to the archery term sin. If you're on the archery range and you fire at the target, and you miss the bullseye, the scorekeeper yells sin. If you miss the target altogether, then the scorekeeper would yell out evil. Like, you're off target totally. But then there's a second translation of the word evil. And that is, in our modern language, would be unripened. So we have a piece of fruit. We just plucked it off the tree and it's hard as a rock. We would say that that piece of fruit is evil in Aramaic. We'd apply that meaning of the word evil. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's not bad. It's not nasty. It's not any of the Greek implications that come with the word evil. It simply means it's not ready to eat. It's not in its proper place or in its proper time for eating. If we picked a piece of fruit from the tree and we left it on the table for a month and came back and it's all brown and mushy and all collapsed on itself, once again, the word evil would be applied to that. If we picked a piece of fruit and we know the moment at which it is its peak of ripeness, the flavors, the smell, the nutrients are at their peak and ready to feed you, and we were to eat that piece of ripened fruit, that piece of fruit is no longer evil. So it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It's just the stage of ripeness that it's at. So when we hear that, sufficient for the day are the evils thereof, what Yeshua is saying is, sufficient for the day, have no more incomplete projects on your plate than you can finish today. Sufficient for the day are the unripe or the incomplete things that you have on your mind. In other words, have any goals for today. Don't hold any goals in your mind that you can't achieve today. And the reason for that is, remember the thing that drives people to the power person dynamic, which is usually what creates the violence in the world, is the power person dynamic. It's been passed on from generation to generation to generation for eons. The thing that takes people to the place where the power person dynamic takes over, oftentimes against their own will and choice, is stress. You won't likely find this piece of information anywhere but here, and in our Laws of Living course. It's basically where it comes from, is that stress is created, and you can go out into the world and you can study. I've done it. Go to stress management courses, and you'll be told about how you've got to have goals, and you've got to set your daily goals and your weekly goals, maybe your hourly goals and your monthly goals and your 6-month goal and your 1-year goal and your 10-year goal and your 20-year goal and your lifetime goal, and you walk out of there with so much stress that you just violated that piece of information Yeshua gave. Sufficient for the day are the goals thereof, the incomplete projects, the things unripened in your life. In other words, each time you set a goal, you create a stress. If you put so many goals into your mind that you are ultra stressed, then your mind is driven to serve up as behavior the power person dynamic, and that's what introduces violence into the world, into relationships, into marriages, into parental relationships, into government relationships, into church relationships. It's goals driving stress, elevating the stress to the point where people default to their power person behavior. So when you understand from the Aramaic perspective that Yeshua is saying is, only set goals that you know you can accomplish today, today being the next waking period, the day sufficient for the day, and put everything else in your planner. We have a worksheet for that. It's called the Mind Goal Management Sheet. And it's about managing your goals. And by managing your goals, you get to, through indirection, manage your mind. And you keep your stress at levels that are acceptable so that the power person dynamic never shows up in your life. So this one idea I would offer is the root, this one missing idea out of Yeshua's mouth. I mean, the genius, we're just scratching the surface of the genius that's in the Aramaic. It's the one language that is based in the physics of the world. If you look at every other language, English, Russian, German, Swedish, Spanish, I don't care what it is, every one of those was made up in the minds of men. We made up, created some grunts and groans, and we called them words, and we said this grunt means this, and that groan means that. So this is all from the minds of men, and the things that came from the minds of men were called the Tower of Babel in that ancient language and teaching. The Aramaic language, if you look at the letters of the Aramaic alphabet, which incidentally, it is the Aramaic alphabet that today is used for writing Hebrew. The letters are actually Aramaic. They are 3D shadows of the atomic periodic table of the elements. If you were to look at the shadow that would be cast by an electron moving around a proton, by 2 electrons moving around 2 protons and a neutron, that 3D shadow is where the letters of the Aramaic alphabet come from. It's rooted in the actual physics of the world, not in the minds of men. And so the genius of what we've been given with just this one piece of information, sufficient for the day, are the goals that you can accomplish. Don't set a goal for tomorrow, because what happens is each time you set a goal, You've instructed the mind to go to work on something. So each goal increases the activity of the mind. If you've got more activity going on in the mind than the mind is designed to handle, then you move into that ultra-stress place, and that's where the automatic decision system kicks in and people start doing power person behaviors. So every goal increases the activity of mind. Think about it in terms of your computer. You know, you've got a computer that when you open it and you say go to your word processor, and you can write away to your heart's content, and it works like a charm. And you're writing something, and you decide you need to look at some information in an email, and so you open your email program, and it works like a charm. And the email program said you needed to look at a picture in your picture program, your picture editor, and you open that, and it works like a charm. And then from that picture, you were instructed you had to go and open your CAD program. And when you opened your CAD program, all of a sudden the computer started to bog down and crash, because sufficient for the operation of your computer means you don't open more programs than the computer can handle. It's kind of the same command. Each goal creates an increased activity in the mind. The mind only has a certain capacity of information or activity that it can process before it starts to crack. And when it starts to crack, that's when we default to those power person behaviors. So remember, every time you set a goal, you're asking your mind to do a job and you're increasing activity in the mind. Do you have the resources to take on that activity? If not, cancel the goal and write it down in your planner. Use the Mind Goal Management Sheet. That's what it's designed for. In order to preserve that goal for future attention, but recognizing, you know, gee, this is something I can't do till next Thursday. Well, if I load a goal in my mind, I've got to pick up the ABC item at the XYZ store next Thursday. If I put that in my mind today, what did I do? I just increased the activity in my mind. Can I do anything with that activity? No, I can't buy it till next Thursday. Then get it out of your mind. Put it down in your planner. You just alleviated your mind of that activity. You've reclaimed the resources. Same as if you notice your computer crashes by the time you get the CAD program open, it's because it's overwhelmed the resources. Close the CAD program down. Or if you need to use CAD, then shut down your word processor and your picture editor. Now your computer runs fine. It's no different with the human mind. The resources are finite in the mind, in physiology. Now, how did Yeshua understand that 2,000 years ago? I don't know. But I'm sure glad he did. Because I certainly probably would never come across that or understand that piece of information without those brain cells, without that knowledge. And what we're going to do as we unfold this study is we're going to uncover just mountains and mountains and mountains of things that are going to empower each person to move beyond the world of fantasy, beyond the world of appearance or constructs of the mind, into developing the skills and the faculties to weaken the dynamics that are already stuck in the mind based in hostility or fear, and open the higher faculties so that we have direct access to the actuality as it is, rather than living in the mind of man, be able to tap into what's the Creator's God in mind, what's the actuality that this is about. So that's the direction we want to head, and I hope that makes sense as another block of information. We're going to, set these up as building blocks, and Jeannie is taking these sessions, and we're going to do this. She's going to do this. Thank you, Jeannie, for your skill and your willingness, your ability to do it. But I'm going to take each of these sessions, turn them into a video, which means they'll just be a picture of some kind. But we'll have in our YouTube channel, each of these lessons will show up sequentially. And so this study will be isolated out and available on our YouTube channel. And I'll just put out a thought and that is if you're out there in listener land and this work has touched you and benefiting you, one of the things we could use is a support in starting to convert what we're ultimately, one of the visions that I'm holding is that ultimately we convert all 5,000 hours of our radio show into a format where they can be loaded on YouTube. So it means that they have to go from an MP3 to an MP4. It takes a conversion process. If you've got the brain cells for that, or even if you don't, but you've got a computer and you'd be willing to support us and assist in that, that'd be an awesome project for somebody to volunteer to participate in and assist us to do. So we appreciate you joining us and hold the space for you to have the best year yet of your eternal life. Thanks and blessings, and look forward to joining you tomorrow.